Okay, we're continuing with slavery in English America. Again, this is Professor TOVANCHE, as you know by now, I suppose. Okay, so let's get right into this. We were talking last time about indentured servitude, slavery, and how these different systems of labor, in fact, existed simultaneously, side by side. You'd have white indentured servants, black indentured servants. You would have white farmers and a few black farmers who were free, right? And of course, you had slaves, all of them black. So the question becomes, why did the English change? Why did it switch? Why did they switch from servitude, indentured servitude, to slavery? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. To begin with, it has to do with the fact that fewer English servants are coming. Remember, by the mid 1600s, it was difficult to get a lot of these people to come over for several reasons. Immigration is slowing down. There are wars back home in England that slows down travel. People are expected to fight in wars for their homeland and so forth. A lot of wars going on in Europe at this time, in these centuries, especially between like England and France. And anyway, right, there's wars back home. Also, people had already learned about the horrible conditions here, that, there's a lot of disease, labor is exploited, meaning workers are exploited. There's a stark class system. Now, of course, the labor was exploited back home in England, and there was a stark class system back home in England as well. But again, all of this coupled with the fact that there's disease and wars back home, all of that slows down English immigration. And at the same time that this is happening, the European slave trade in the Atlantic has increased dramatically. And what I'm talking about is really, in fact, most slaves not even coming to what becomes the United States. Most slaves that are taken from Africa are actually sent to the Caribbean and Brazil. By far, most of them. And these are brutal, brutal slave systems. Sometimes the slavery in these areas, in the Sugar Islands in particular, is worse than what you would see generally writ large across the 13 English colonies, the colonies that would become the 13 English colonies. So the European slave trade is booming. Everybody's doing it, quote unquote. And so a lot of people are looking at this as a possibility to maybe own land and own slaves themselves. And so what you do see is a lot of investment in land over here. But you do see a somewhat slowing down of immigration by the lower orders of people who would ordinarily have come as indentured servants. And at the same time, land-owning colonists are realizing that slavery has advantages over indentured servitude. And these, of course, should probably jump out at you. What are the differences? Well, indentured servants generally work under a contract. It ends. It has an end point, right? Even if sometimes they get cheated out of stuff, that maybe they have to work an extra year or something, they are promised something, and they do have the rights of Englishmen, so they can get something from their master at the end of this term. It could be land. It could actually be a skill that would set them for life pretty well. So there's that, right? Servants are generally under contract. White servants also cause trouble for wealthy planters. White servants, English servants, they want the rights of Englishmen. They demand them, and in fact, they are promised them. So they have the rights of Englishmen, and under that, they want not just land, but they want power. They have this idea that coming here means more freedom for them. Sure. And so they will actually cause trouble for the wealthy planters who themselves want to maintain control. So there's a mass of people at the bottom who are indentured servants who eventually want land and more power. And if you are the guy at the top, a wealthy planter, you might look at this and think, I really don't feel like sharing all these goodies. There's a lot of land out there, and I want it for myself. So they cause this kind of trouble for planters. They also cause another kind of trouble for planters. A lot of times, white indentured servants help slaves escape. Remember, white indentured servants would also sometimes run away with black indentured servants. So there was this camaraderie amongst them that, in fact, made it more difficult to control the labor source from the point of view of a wealthy planter. So, they want land and power. They kind of mix together with the slaves, helping each other out and so forth. And a lot of times these poorer white or these small farmers who were indentured will move on to the frontier and very often onto native lands. And of course, a lot of native people aren't going to like that. And so the native peoples will take it out on the entire colony. So as more white servants are moving out into the interior on their own, just settling on land because they feel like it, right? It creates a problem for the colony's leaders and so forth. So white servants, they cause some problems for the wealthy planters. Also, it's more easy for them to escape. If you are a white indentured servant living in Virginia, for example, if you escape from your indenture, your servitude, which happens, people run away, right? Because it's like, well, I don't really feel like working another couple years under my contract. I think I'm just going to go. Whoops. As a white indentured servant, if you escape, let's say, from Virginia to Maryland, and you're walking down the street, somebody looks at you, and as far as they're concerned, you're just another white guy walking down the street. Of course, all of these things are going to be very different with regard to Black folk, which we'll talk about very shortly. So they blend in with the local population of people more easily. The people who are considered free. White people are not slaves, although they could be indentured servants. The point is, you look at this person as a white person, you don't know what they are. You don't question it, really. Another thing is that white servants die more easily from tropical diseases, in the Chesapeake especially, where malaria is rampant. The Chesapeake, of course, being Virginia, Maryland. They die more easily from tropical diseases. Of course, slaves, on the other hand, are going to be, they're going to have none of these things, really. You work for life. It's very, very difficult to be freed from chattel slavery. You have no contract. You have no land. Even if you get freed somehow, you get no land, and you generally, sometimes you do, but you generally don't have any skills. You might have skills as a slave. We'll talk more about that later, because slaves did a variety of tasks. Point is, because there's no contract, it doesn't end. You don't get land, and very often you were, especially if you were working in the tobacco field, just a field slave. And so, from the point of view of the wealthy, it's better to have this kind of worker. All of this, of course, is very economic based, right? Financial based. But of course, we have to remember they're making these decisions, these economic and financial decisions, on the backs of human beings who, in fact, are even English and therefore do not have the rights of Englishmen. These are Africans. The slaves are going to be of African descent, and therefore they're not going to have the rights of Englishmen. They cannot demand the rights of Englishmen. Indentured servants, the white indentured servants, demand the rights of Englishmen. They're not going to have that. And of course, it's going to be very, very difficult to escape from slavery. If you run away from Virginia to Maryland, so to speak, or for example, and you're walking down the street, as this idea that slaves are, or that Black people are to be enslaved, as this idea begins to grow, and it does, as this idea begins to grow, if you are a Black man walking down the street, then people are going to look at you twice. Like, who is this guy? He's not just an ordinary guy walking down the street, because I know in the back of my mind that Black people are becoming enslaved across the colonies. So their status, it is burned into their very skin. And unlike white indentured servants, they're more resistant to malaria, right? The native peoples, that didn't work out. They're dying out, or fighting back or melting into the woods. White people are dying out as well. And another advantage, so to speak, of African slavery over indentured servitude is that these people are not Christian. At least not at first. They will become Christian down the road. But in the early years of the Atlantic slave trade, when people were brought here, right, they weren't likely to be, a lot of them were Muslims. and any other number of religions. And the point is that as these Africans are not Christians, white English people could have their conscience eased because they're not then enslaving fellow Christians. Because, in fact, if they were, when they had a contract over a white indentured servant, there was this idea of, you can't treat these people too badly because they're children of God. Well, they don't see Africans this way. Remember, religion is a major component of people's cultural lives at this time. And so they would see anyone outside their religion as heathen, animalistic perhaps, certainly not on the same level as themselves. So they're not Christian. Another thing is that Africans tend to be more easily controlled. These people are going to be ripped from their families, from their whole culture, their whole way of life. They're going to, and so when they come here, they're in a completely foreign land. Sure, so are white indentured servants when they come here, but they have the rights of Englishmen, the white indentured servants. These people do not. They have no rights at all, and they have been removed to a completely foreign land and are forced into sort of fitting themselves into a whole new sort of culture. And for them, it becomes a sort of slave culture. Another reason that they switch over to slavery, African slavery, is because these people don't have the rights of Englishmen and all these other reasons that we talked about, right? And of course, with Virginia and other colonies passing new laws basing slavery or freedom on the condition of the mother, these slaves are able to reproduce themselves as slaves. A white indentured servant who had a child, remember, or any indentured servant who had a child would not have their child automatically enslaved. They would have them indentured, but only until the end of that period of time. Unlike for African slaves, of course, as we noted in the 1600s, Virginia starts this out, right? And they say, look, any child born to an unfree mother is automatically a slave, follows the condition of the mother. And so what you're seeing here is that a population of slaves can reproduce itself. Sorry, that was my phone. And so another thing is that by creating race-based slavery, they're starting to make distinctions between white and black. You can divide and conquer the masses. You have to remember, often white people and black people ran away together. Sometimes they engaged in rebellion together. Talked about a slave or an indentured, the first slave who was an indentured servant had run away with a couple of white indentured servants. They get time added, but the black man becomes a slave, right? The point is, this happened a lot. So there was camaraderie amongst the lower classes, amongst the working class, the laboring sort. An example of this whole desire to separate them out actually it comes in the form of something that happens in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. You might have heard of Bacon's Rebellion before. This happens in Virginia, 1676. I'll just give you really, really brief background. In Virginia, right, with its capital of Jamestown, the wealthy control the government. And because they control the government, they pass laws that favor themselves, and they pass laws that disfavor the masses. They would pass laws, just for example, that would increase the length of indenture for indentured servants. So you had a 4-year contract, we're going to add a year because we need your labor. Things like that. So, of course, they control the government. They also control the best land, make the money off of it. They, of course, hold the land that is right next to waterways. And so that means that the the poorer sort, the people who are free, but who are maybe farmers, they will hold the land that's in the interior, on the frontier, which of course is going to be problematic for these folks because there's a lot of people out there who don't want them, namely Native Americans, right? See, these Native peoples feel encroached upon when the settlements are moving outward. And who is it, who are the real people, who are actually the people who are doing this? Well, the lower sorts of people, the people who can't afford the good land inward by, in the safe areas of the colony. And so a lot of these poor farmers, most of them white, a couple of them black, most of these poor white farmers live in the interior, and they resent that the wealthy kind of use them as a buffer between themselves and native folks. So this is the kind of a quick and dirty on Bacon's rebellion. I'm sure you can find this information anywhere, but here's the thing. A guy named Nathaniel Bacon leads a revolt. He burns Jamestown to the ground. Now, this revolt is eventually crushed, but why is this significant for this as a turning point? Well, Bacon brings together a motley crew of rebels. He brings together white farmers, a few black farmers, a bunch of white indentured servants, some black indentured servants, and slaves, all of them black, right? He brings together this lower orders of people, and he promises them freedom, he promises them land. Now, I should say, he doesn't really care about these people. He uses them against the wealthy. Because Nathaniel Bacon, this guy's no revolutionary for the man, against the man, right? He's not a man working for the people. This guy's out for himself. And he realizes that as this sort of not quite wealthy planter or farmer, he can actually take power from the main guys if he brings the masses together against them. So what does this mean for the wealthy? The revolt is crushed, sure. But how do you prevent this from happening in the future? How do you prevent all these people coming at you? Well, how do you maintain power over the masses who you need to work your land and who you don't want vying with you for power, right? And the goodies that the colonies can provide. What do? You separate them. What's the easiest way to separate them? Color. So what happens is within 10 years, what you're already seeing is a separation. After Bacon's rebellion, white folk are going to see better conditions for them. They're going to be more and more likely to be given the rights of Englishmen. So there's going to be an end to the extension of those indentured contracts. They're going to have greater voting rights. They're going to have, for example, they're not going to have as high poll taxes. A poll tax, of course, is where you have to go pay to vote. That's one of the problems that they had. These poor white people, they had to pay to vote, so they couldn't vote. Well, now they have lower poll taxes, which of course translates into greater voting for them, a greater say in government, and of course the extensions on indentures, all that comes to an end. Now, for black people, on the other hand, things get worse. The slave codes are harsher. For example, in the years following Bacon's rebellion, colonies begin to pass laws saying a master can kill his own slave, and there will be no repercussions for this because he's destroying his property. Much as he can just burn down his house if he wants to out in the middle of nowhere, well, he can kill his own slave. So things are getting harsh for black people here. And this happens in Virginia, by the way, right? And these will spread down the road. But the slave codes in Virginia get harsher. Masters can kill their own slaves. Also, Virginia says all white people must police slaves. So you have to actually actively police slaves. You have to be a part of a slave patrol. So not only are you not friends with the other person who doesn't look like you, now you are going to go hunt him if he ever runs away. So slave codes are getting harsh. In Virginia, also, you see restrictions on free black people. They are going to be restricted in their movements, whether or not they can come and go into town. They're going, and if they break these rules, they're gonna be harsh punishment. And in fact, harsh punishments will be meted out for theft or any sense that a rebellion might be afoot. And so the point is here that after Bacon's rebellion, slave codes are getting harsher and the restrictions on free black peoples are getting harsher. And in fact, in Virginia, they outright declare that black people and white people are not equal. So think about what this does, right? Mentally, psychologically, separating these people out. Black and white people, even, by the way, are not allowed to fraternize with each other. They're not allowed to hang out. What do you mean you think you have a white friend? What do you mean you think you have a black friend? No, you don't. Whether you're free or not, you must hang out with your own kind. So we should understand that all of this creates separate society. It creates a separation among the lower classes of people who had things in common, right? That they were all oppressed by the man, so to speak. They were at the bottom. Well, now you see the color line being used to separate that out, to separate these people out. And there's a sense of white identity that is growing. It's growing amongst the wealthy for sure, in the middle class, but also among the poor people. So the man uses race, color, in order to separate these people out. And in order to create this mountain between them, or a valley, if you prefer, whatever metaphor you wish to use, to create a division between them based on differences, when in fact they have a lot in common. And the man's been doing this forever. I mean, throughout our history, we've seen this, where people will focus, instead of focusing on the things that we have in common with each other, right? We're all, voters, we're all poor, we're all working class, we're all, whatever it is. People tend to focus on instead, and of course, a lot of politicians will point to these things and say, look, this person doesn't look like you. This person doesn't worship the way you do. This person has, sexual tendencies that are against this and again, you get the point, right? And so we focus on these things rather than focusing on those things that would hold us together. And that, so that separation persists today. Now, it doesn't mean that slaves give up at this time, right? Even though they had sort of, quote unquote, lost their brothers in arms, right? Even though they had done this, slaves, chafing under this harsh system, will sometimes still plan uprisings. Just give you an example. In 1687 in Virginia, a group of slaves plans an uprising. Now, this plan is discovered. So you see that they're pushing back, but of course, unfortunately for them, what happens is that things get worse for all black people. And after this squashed uprising, Virginia slave codes are tightened. Freedoms of free black folks are even more restricted by law than before. So every time something like this happens, anytime there's a rebellion, you see slave codes get tightened and restrictions on free black people get tightened too. And right after this aborted, or this discovered, this squashed, this uprising that never really gets off the ground, the Virginia governor right after this says that the laws that we have put in place are meant to show black people, and he says, quote, that there is a distinction between their offspring and those of Englishmen, unquote. Basically saying your kids are different from mine and you will never be equal, he says. So this is already before 1700. This, of course, comes, decades after the White Lion got here, decades after Anthony Johnson, was at the height of his, of his wealth and so forth. And so by 1700, you're going to see laws like Virginia's passed on, or excuse me, be passed also in places like Maryland. Maryland follows suit with similar laws. So in the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, you're going to see the idea that black equals slave. That is gaining ground. You're going to see laws sharpening the differences between black and white. You're going to see the Chesapeake actually, these colonies becoming slave societies, not just societies with slaves. What does that mean? Well, what we're going to see that grows in the South is slave societies. These are societies that have, in fact, pretty much everything in terms of politics, economics, social status, the law, all of it is undergirded by slavery. Slavery is the bedrock of these societies. It is the basis of the economy for sure. It is the basis of society, politics, and law. You're going to see that places like Chesapeake and then lower south are going to become slave societies. Now, in the early years, though, you're still going to see a sizable population of free black people. And in fact, there's always going to be a population of free black people in these states, in these colonies. Of course, that's going to change as things get worse and more black people are going to be moving up north and so forth. But in the early years, there are free black people. By about 1800 or so, there's going to be some 300,000 or so free black people in the United States. Most of them moving up north, but still a lot in the South. Okay, that's getting a little bit far ahead. So by the early 1700s, slave codes are tightening, and freedoms of free black people are being restricted by law. In fact, by about 1720, they passed laws saying, and this, of course, is in the Chesapeake, they passed laws saying, black people, free or not, they can't carry weapons, right? They passed laws saying they cannot vote. So the color line is hardening. We have the growth, it seems, of democracy for white folk. But for black folk, we're seeing that they are being relegated to this relegated under this idea that they are, in fact, to be slaves. Okay, let's move up the coast a little bit. Let's talk about New England. So we know that New England is settled in the 1620s largely by religious folk, Protestants, people who, of course, had left England. These are the Pilgrims, these are the Puritans that you're familiar with, I'm sure, right? Now, we should recognize or should repeat that these people did not come here for religious freedom for all. Yes, they wanted to escape religious persecution, but they wanted to escape their persecution. They were fine persecuting others for their religious beliefs or any kind of heretical, non-believing, non-Christian beliefs. These people want to spread their own message, their type of Christianity, which, remember, was an offshoot of Catholicism. Now, I'll tell you, just to put it I'll put it very bluntly, those who did come here for religious reasons, almost all of them would likely have believed that most, if not all of us, are going to hell. These people had punishment, not just for worshiping other gods, but punishment for people who celebrated Christmas. They didn't believe in Christmas in the way that we understand it today. They would not have liked the fact that so many Christians today have a Christmas tree in their homes, because that's a blend of pagan ritual with true Christianity as they saw it. Point being, these are religious folk, and they came here for religious freedom for themselves, really to build a society that was only for themselves. Now, life in the North, in New England, is going to be better. Life in New England, it's going to be largely middle class. You're not going to have a lot of landowners here. So you're not going to see a bunch of poor indentured servants. You will see servants and you will see slaves, but not the way you do in the South with these large cash crops in the South. In the North, you're not going to see large cash crops. You're going to see mostly family farming. And where there are large landowners, you're generally going to be broken up into smaller estates, and they're going to rent them out and so forth to smaller farmers. Point being that a lot more people are self-sufficient in the North than they are in the South. And there's a varied economy. There's no single cash crop, as I said. There's small family farms, and there's going to be a lot of fishing and shipbuilding, and and all that. And so it's not going to just be based on a cash crop like tobacco. And because there are families and very few single people coming over, it's going to be a more stable society, and it's going to be healthier. It's up north, so it's colder, right? A lot colder in Vermont than it is in the Chesapeake. So That means, of course, less disease. It's healthier because there's less disease. It's healthier also because there's not going to be a single cash crop. They're going to have a varied diet. People are going to grow all kinds of different vegetables or whatever they can, trade with each other. And a lot of people are going to be living in town. So there's going to be a lot of town living. In fact, the Puritans don't like people living on the outskirts of their towns, right? You have to be inside the town where we can watch you, because we want to make sure you're a good Christian and that you do not upset our idea of a city upon a hill. Now, slavery exists here too. The Puritans are, in fact, the first English colonists to legalize chattel slavery. They do it in 1641 with what is called the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Now, what they say, and if you ever read this, and I used to have my students read these, and they're kind of interesting, but I decided to kind of leave them out for right now. But the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, if you look at it, a lot of the language, in fact, is taken from the Bible. A lot of it tracks the Ten Commandments pretty closely. You cannot worship another god, for example. There's punishment for that. There's a death punishment for that. And also they have slavery embedded in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. They say it is based on Old Testament rules. And of course, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, or at least the ideas that are built within it, will spread to other New England colonies. As you can see there on the graphic, there's a lot of New England colonies, as you know, that spread out, that crop up, I should say. Sorry, I was on mute, and I'm not sure where not sure where I muted myself. I think I know. Let me back up to 1650s. We covered the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. I'm pretty sure you heard that. So by the 1650s, we know that the colonies are expanding, and that New England is expanding, I should say. More colonies are cropping up, and they're also taking up slavery. Rhode Island is an example of a colony that outlawed slavery initially, but then later on okays it for financial reasons, like a lot of people do in the South, have financial reasons. So they had Rhode Island, when it was founded in the 1630s, it had outlawed slavery, but later on it legalizes it. And in fact, Rhode Island becomes a major importer of slaves. Now, in New England, we're not seeing slave societies. These are not societies that are based upon slavery. Unlike in the South, where slavery is the end-all and be-all of their society, because it rests on a cash crop and rests on a social hierarchy with laws and politics that support all of that. In New England, you're going to see a society with slaves. These are societies that really are based on other things, for example, religion, right? But which also have slaves. In the North, New England, a lot of slaves, most slaves are going to be domestic servants. They're going to be farmhands. And in fact, a lot of these farmhands very often are working side by side on the family farm with the very people who own them. Now, I should just take a moment to say, language is limited. When I use words like own, I mean, I'm forced to do air quotes here and there, but you all know what I mean, right? So, when I talk about masters, owners, slave owners, there's no real good word to say this. A lot of people are saying enslavers now, and yeah, to me it sounds a little clunky. We know what we're talking about, right? When it comes to slavery, there's really no good way to talk about it. Anyway, these farmhands, workers, slaves, on in New England are very often domestic servants or farmhands, or they're just workers who are unskilled, maybe loading stuff on and off of ships on the port in the ports, or maybe even skilled workers. In fact, there's a lot of slaves who are skilled workers in New England. They become skilled over time, especially, but most of the ones that you're going to see in New England are going to start off as what are called refuse slaves. Refuse, almost like garbage, disposable and cheap. What we're talking about is the old and the sick and the very young. Now, the very young, of course, old and sick, those are going to be, that's obvious, right? An old person only has so many good years left, and how much work can they do anyway? Someone who's sick or lame or something, that's a problem. Also, the very young, some of them are too young to work in the harsher environments of the South. Excuse me. So when a child is born to a slave in places like New England, sometimes they don't want to take care of the child because the owner doesn't want to take care of the child because that costs money, and sometimes they want to sell them to, but nobody wants to buy the child, the baby, right? And so babies are not always wanted. A lot of times babies are given away free. Or if I'm a slaveholder and my slave just had a baby and I don't want to be responsible for that child, I would see the child as property. I don't want to be responsible for that property. Then I will actually maybe give it to the neighbor down the road. And if the neighbor says no, I might say, you know what, take some money for it. So I would pay to get rid of this person. Now, it is the very young that grow up in the North who will be very much acculturated into English ways. Acculturation, you may know, is basically just the acquisition or the giving to of culture. All of us are acculturated somehow or another by the people who came before us, right? Acculturated, ACCULTURATED. I probably should have written that down, but you have it. There it is. So because they grow up as from very young, and because they are living in the North where there are few slaves, you got to remember in New England, you might be the only slave living within 10, 20 miles because you're out in the middle of nowhere on a farm. Now, it's probably not like that in most places, but the point is, in these towns, there's only a few slaves. Even if every town has, or every other or every few households has a slave, there's still going to be only a few slaves, and you are going to be acculturated into English ways of speaking and doing things. In fact, a lot of slaves learn how to read and write in the North, much more so than in the South. Point is, these people, New Englanders, are invested in slavery. They trade heavily with slave societies that are growing up in the South. They're trading in the international slave trade, not just the domestic slave trade, but the international trade. They trade with, in food, raw materials, finished goods, and of course, slaves. So they trade heavily in slavery, and they actually build a lot of ships that are used in the slave trade. So they have an interest in slavery, although it is not as strong as the interest that Southerners will have. But slavery exists. And as in the South, in New England, you're going to see the hardening of the color line. they will pass laws to keep black people apart from white people. I'll just give you an example. In Massachusetts in 1705, a law is passed outlawing marriage between white people and anybody else. Now, it allows anybody else to marry each other. For example, a Native American could probably marry a black person if that were going to happen, but there's no mixing of the races with white people. That's outlawed. Now think about something for just a moment. Why pass this law? Why pass any law? You pass a law. I mean, is it possible for us to think of a law that doesn't exist now, but which in 100 years we will need? Probably not. It would be very difficult, I think. If you can do it, then send me that law and I'll be very impressed. A law that we don't have now, but which we know in 100 years we will have or need or should have. We pass laws to prevent those things that are already happening, not to prevent those things that we've never seen happen. So if they pass a law in 1705 in Massachusetts outlawing marriage between white people and others, what do we know? It was happening. And there's lots of evidence to this effect. So they are intent on building up the color line, sharpening the color line, hardening the color line, whatever metaphor you want to use, right? But at the same time that this was happening, New England is going to have the first challenge to slavery in the English colonies. It's going to be a New Englander to challenge slavery first. And that guy was a guy named Samuel Sewall. Now, Samuel Sewall, he had been a judge at the Salem witch trials. You've heard of the Salem witch trials, no doubt. And of course, we know that the Salem witch trials were sparked, at least, blamed on a black slave woman named Tituba, right? Tituba, Tituba. And, she was a West Indian slave that was living in Salem back in the 1690, and sparked this whole Salem witch trial thing. Now, she was from the West Indies. She did have this sort of connection to what people would call pagan religions, voodoo, and so forth and so on. And so, so there's probably some truth there. But the point is, this guy had been a judge at the Salem witch trials where all this had happened. Samuel Sewall tells his fellow New Englanders that they've misinterpreted the Bible. You see, Puritans had for a very long time argued that slavery was okay. They say, hey, the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, even though it speaks of slavery very, very often. If you ever read the Old Testament, slavery's all up in there. And they say, well, the Bible doesn't condemn it, and therefore God doesn't condemn it. But Samuel Sewall says, no. The Bible does not really allow slavery. You're misinterpreting it. And of course, everybody interprets scripture their own way. You're misinterpreting it. And so he calls what the New Englanders are doing man-stealing. You're man-stealing. He says, Africans are descended from Adam and Eve. They are human beings, and therefore they should have equal rights. He says slavery is unchristian. And he's going to inspire others in Massachusetts to believe this way. Because, think what you might about Puritans. At the end of the day, they wanted to be devout to God's word. They wanted to follow it. And so a lot of people start questioning slavery. This happens in the North. It doesn't happen so much in the South. And we'll get back to that question as to why. The thing about it, though, is that these white New Englanders who are pushing against slavery, they're fighting an uphill battle. Most white New Englanders claim that the Bible is God's words, and they go further to say God wants it this way because slaves who are African and really inferior, they're better off being with us who are true Christians than others. We will take care of them as is God's will. who knows how others will treat them? We treat ours better than other people treat theirs, so to speak. Now, there was a, you know, here's the thing, you know, in the North, things are better for slaves, and we'll talk more about that down the road. Things are harsher the farther down south you go, but at the end of the day, you're still a slave. At the end of the day, your children are not your own. At the end of the day, you can't move around, let alone vote or have a black friend or white friend, I should say, if you're a slave. So people who, you know, say, who defend slavery as God's ways, God's will use this argument of paternalism, you know, pater meaning father, almost as though we are sort of a fatherly figure over these people who don't otherwise know how to behave. We will take care of them. So they point to this. They also point to racial differences, which, you know, are real or imagined, however you want to put it. But they will talk about the differences between black people and white people, and how black people are really not, they're not saved, basically. So, in short, African slavery is embraced in New England. Over time, it expands. You will have black codes, which of course have to do with free black people, but you also have slave codes. Now, and again, it's less harsh in the South. I'll just give you a couple examples. Legal marriage among slaves is allowed in some New England colonies. It's not allowed in places in the South, but you have in the North legal marriages among slaves. They are recognized. Now, it's very little comfort that the colony recognizes your marriage to a fellow slave if your spouse lives on a farm miles down the road. And in fact, that was normal. They called it being married abroad. That was normal. Where if I was married to another slave, I might be over here with Farmer Jones, my master, but my wife is working for Farmer Johnson 6 miles down the road, which means I can't see her every day. So, you know, it's not great, but there is at least a recognition of something there. Also, a lot of slaves in New England attend church. Now, they're not going to be taught about Moses, right? Because that can only bring trouble, right? Moses, who, according to the Bible, led the exodus of the enslaved Jews out of Egypt. They are instead going to be taught about salvation in the afterlife. They're going to be taught that whole the meek shall inherit the earth stuff, where they will say, you know, be satisfied with what you have now, because your equality, your spiritual equality may come in God's kingdom, right? So they start accepting this idea that that even Africans can be saved. So, you know, they have their marriages legalized. They're attending church. And in some places in the North, in New England, they have a right to a jury trial. So you're not going to see these things really in the South. Not very much. Certainly, you know, not legal marriages, and certainly not a right to a trial by jury, although some of them will end up attending church later on, as we'll see. So things are less harsh in the South, but you're still a slave. You have no choice. You're subject to punishment. You're subject to rape. And you can't protect your own children, who are sometimes given away. In fact, in 1680, in Massachusetts, Massachusetts adopts the rule condition of the mother. So you start seeing these rules spreading around. So the idea that black people are slaves begins to spread throughout the colonies. So you can't protect your own children. You are subject to rape. You're subject to punishment. You have no choice in your life. And if you're an old slave, sometimes you're just given away to whoever is going to take care of you. Very often, they will just free you and let you fend for yourself because you did all the work that I need you to do. You're too old now. I don't need you. Now, this didn't always happen. Sometimes slaves would remain with the family. it was never a done deal. These people are living precarious lives. So by 1700, slavery is taking a deep hold in New England. And, oh, by the way, in 1705, Massachusetts outlaws interracial marriage altogether. I already said that. Sorry. I don't know why I have that jotted down. I've already said that. Point is, let me rephrase, right? By 1700, slavery is taking deep hold in New England. The color line is hardening, right? And you're starting to see a growing or sharper division between black and white. The next time we talk, we're going to talk about the middle colonies. I think I'm going to leave it there and come back and give you a part 3 next time. All right. Thank you for listening. Be well and be good. Bye.